Welcome to the Story of Channel. Make some noise out there, my friends, wherever in the world you might be listening from. Don't forget to subscribe. To those who already have, may boundless luck and overflowing blessings come your way. The mouth-watering aroma of sautéed garlic, onions, and the bubbling, rich gravy of a slow-smoked beef brisket, alongside a savory, tangy, Southern-style chicken stew, had filled every corner of our kitchen since the crack of dawn. The hot, appetizing steam enveloped our small, cramped 12 by 15-foot kitchen. I wiped the sweat dripping down my forehead, using a small hand towel draped over my shoulder. The apron I was wearing was already damp from the intense heat radiating from the stove. Since last night, my fingers hadn't stopped peeling potatoes, crushing black peppercorns, and slicing thick cuts of meat to prepare a massive, festive luncheon for the entire extended family of my husband, Paul. As a wife who also independently runs a small, but highly successful neighborhood diner just outside our gated suburban community, I knew exactly how to cook for large crowds without ever sacrificing the delicious taste and quality of the food. For me, serving a meal that I had poured my heart and hard work into for my husband's family was the highest form of respect and undeniable proof that I was a reliable and dedicated homemaker. But the warm, cheerful atmosphere in the kitchen suddenly vanished when I heard heavy, hurried footsteps stomping from the living room. My mother-in-law, Linda, suddenly appeared in the doorway. Her arms were tightly crossed over her chest. She glared at me from head to toe with a mixture of intense disgust and pure condescension. The sparkling, sequin-studded cocktail dress she was wearing was a stark contrast to my appearance. I was just wearing comfortable house clothes and an apron stained with barbecue sauce and paprika. Her face, plastered with thick makeup and bright red lipstick, immediately scrunched into a nasty scowl the moment she inhaled the scent of what I was cooking on the gas stove. She marched over and deliberately tapped her acrylic nails adorned with heavy gold rings loudly against the wooden counter where I was prepping the large serving platters. "Lena, do you really have no shame at all? You actually have the nerve to cook this kind of low-class, blue-collar diner food for my luncheon this afternoon?" Linda shrieked, her high-pitched voice shattering the peace of the kitchen. My hand, holding the wooden ladle, froze in midair. I took a deep breath. I forced myself to remain calm, offering a small, polite smile before turning to face the older woman, who did nothing but make demands. In the gentlest tone possible, I explained that these exact dishes were the absolute favorites of their extended family, including my late father-in-law. Furthermore, I reminded her that every single ingredient from the expensive cuts of beef to the organic chicken was purchased using my own hard-earned savings from the diner. Without asking for a single penny from her son, Paul, Linda let out a loud, exaggerated sigh and rolled her eyes in sheer revulsion. My words went right through her distinguished ears like a passing breeze. She stomped closer and violently yanked the lids off the pots and platters lined up on the table, creating a deafening metallic clatter. "Are you completely clueless? The guests I invited this afternoon aren't just our regular suburban neighbors. They are the affluent ladies, the socialites from the Homeowners Association Board and the local country club," she yelled, her eyes practically bulging out of her head. She added in a deeply insulting tone that serving ordinary, home-cooked comfort food to her elitist friends would completely drag down her dignity and the flawless reputation she had spent decades building in this upscale subdivision. Hearing the commotion in the kitchen, Paul came running in, panic and confusion written all over his face. My husband looked at my stiffened posture in front of the stove and then turned to his mother, who was now panting with rage and overwhelming arrogance. Instead of defending me, the wife who had been awake since 2 a.m. preparing everything out of the goodness of her heart, Paul walked over to his mother and gently rubbed her back. "Mom, that's enough. Lena's cooking is actually really good. People line up at her diner every single day." Paul tried to pacify her, but his voice was incredibly weak and entirely stripped of any authority. "Shut up, Paul. You've been brainwashed by your cheap, penny-pinching wife. Do you want us to be the laughingstock of the country club later?" Linda bellowed, immediately forcing my spineless husband to shut his mouth. Without warning, and without a single ounce of pity, Linda grabbed a massive platter of the freshly cooked, steaming beef brisket from the counter. In one swift, violent motion, she marched over to the corner of the kitchen and dumped the entire contents directly into the large black trash can. I gasped loudly. My hands instantly flew to cover my mouth in pure shock as I watched the food I had poured my blood, sweat, and tears into mixing with rotting garbage. But she wasn't finished. Linda's sheer madness continued as she grabbed the heavy pot of the savory southern chicken stew and poured the delicious, perfectly seasoned broth straight down the sink drain until the pot was entirely empty. Paul just stood there like a statue. He didn't even dare to speak up or grab his mother's arm to stop her from destroying his own wife's hard work. My chest tightened painfully. A deep, agonizing sting buried itself in my heart as I watched my labor of love being tossed away like disgusting poison. But I fiercely held back my tears in front of this arrogant woman. I clenched my fists tightly behind my apron, staring directly into her eyes. Once she was absolutely sure that all the food I had cooked was ruined and completely inedible, Linda slammed the empty pot onto the tiled floor, flashing an infuriating, triumphant smirk. She dug into her fake designer handbag, pulled out a glossy, high-end flyer, and threw it aggressively at my chest before it fluttered to the floor. I already ordered a VIP premium catering package from the most famous, expensive luxury restaurant in downtown. It's good for 200 people. It even comes with uniformed waitstaff, she announced boastfully. She calmly added that the total cost for that luxurious catering was a staggering $5,000. It was an astronomical amount for a simple backyard house party. And remember this, Lena, I ordered all of it under your name, as the generous daughter-in-law of this household. So when the delivery manager arrives with the receipt, you are going to pay for it. Linda sneered, pointing a finger adorned with a massive cocktail ring right in my face. She genuinely thought her financial terrorism would bring me to my knees, making me cry and forcing me to drain my small business capital just to satisfy her delusional vanity. When Paul heard the thousands of dollars mentioned, his eyes widened in horror. He whispered a complaint to his mother, frantically stating that his savings weren't nearly enough to cover such a massive, sudden expense. Linda completely ignored her son's panic. She dramatically spun around and strutted away, leaving us in the ruined kitchen to go prepare to welcome her guests in the living room. Paul looked at me with a pathetic mix of blame and begging. He was desperately hoping I would yield, perhaps take out a loan or drain my bank account to save his mother's face in front of the crowd later. I didn't say a single word to my husband. Instead, I slowly untied my barbecue-stained apron, took it off, and neatly folded it on top of the counter that was now completely bare and empty. Instead of crying or throwing a tantrum over my mother-in-law's cruelty, a thin, sweet smile formed on my lips. A brilliant, calculated plan for revenge was already taking shape in my mind, and I swore to myself I would not shell out a single red cent for their arrogant vanity. By 11:00 a.m., it started getting noisy outside our house. It was the signal that Linda's invited guests were swarming in, arriving in their leased luxury SUVs and Mercedes-Benzes. Peeking through the gap in my bedroom curtains, I watched the group of women dressed in extravagant designer outfits strutting into our backyard. They were busy showing off their designer handbags, gold bracelets that clinked with every movement, and letting out fake, pretentious laughs just to look high-class in each other's eyes. Meanwhile, Paul was pacing back and forth in the living room, extreme anxiety etched onto his face. He kept throwing nervous glances at my bedroom door, seemingly praying that I would emerge with a thick stack of cash to salvage his mother's reputation. I purposely ignored his incessant knocking from earlier. I chose to take my time getting ready, calmly brushing my hair and adjusting my decent, elegantly simple blouse in front of my vanity mirror with total composure. Out in the living room, Linda was standing tall. Her chin was held high, projecting her voice loudly to ensure the entire neighborhood heard her greeting her fellow socialites. "Oh, Martha, welcome. Come on in. Please excuse the house, it's a bit simple right now. But don't you worry about the food. I had today's luncheon specially catered by the most premium 5-star restaurant in the city," she boasted loudly. I stepped out of my room and walked toward them, my head held high. I offered sincere, polite smiles to the guests, completely masking any heaviness in my heart. A few neighbors who knew I owned a diner whispered among themselves, visibly confused as to why they couldn't smell a single trace of home-cooked food coming from our kitchen today. As soon as I reached the hallway leading to the kitchen, Paul tightly grabbed my arm. His face was as pale as a ghost, looking like he was being chased by a debt collector. "Lena, Do you have the money ready? Mom said the catering is almost here, and they'll charge us on the spot, he whispered, trembling with sheer panic. I gently but firmly brushed my husband's hand off my arm. I looked into his eyes, which were filled with terror over what his mother might do if this day fell apart. I simply smiled sweetly, smoothed out the hem of my blouse, and told him in the calmest tone imaginable that everything happening today would be incredibly joyful and absolutely unforgettable. Before Paul could even formulate a response, a massive black delivery truck bearing the gold logo of a five-star downtown luxury restaurant pulled up right in front of our driveway, cutting off all the chatter in the yard. Two muscular men, dressed in formal black uniforms and premium leather aprons, stepped out and began unloading 12 gleaming stainless steel chafing dishes and food warmers. Upon seeing them, Linda literally clapped her hands in delight. She called all her friends over to witness the sheer opulence she had purposely ordered to stroke her massive ego. "Oh, there's my VIP catering now. Come here, ladies, let's look at the menu. This is real five-star hotel quality, not some cheap, blue-collar home cooking," Linda loudly remarked, intentionally shooting daggers at me with her eyes. The waitstaff swiftly arranged the feast on the long buffet table in the center of the living room. They replaced my old melamine plates with shining gold and silver chafing dishes. The mouth-watering scent of prime rib, truffle mushroom bisque, and various modern, high-end culinary delights instantly filled the air. The country club ladies' jaws dropped in awe, lavishly praising Linda's expensive taste. My mother-in-law soaked up the compliments, her face blooming like a proud flower. She waved her hand dismissively, acting as if she were the most generous, wealthiest queen in the entire suburb. She didn't care in the slightest that all the luxury she was flaunting was built on the tears of her daughter-in-law and a filthy, manipulative lie. Amidst the guests' infatuation as they constantly snapped pictures of the food to post on Facebook and Instagram, one of the catering staff, who appeared to be the operations manager, stepped forward. The man was holding a clipboard with a large invoice attached, stamped with a red official seal. He scanned the noisy room, looking for the person responsible for the massive balance that needed to be paid in full before the dining could commence. When Linda saw the manager holding the bill, she slowly backed away. She subtly darted her eyes around the room and located me standing near the living room wall, wearing her most plastic, fake smile. Linda sidled up to the manager while tightly gripping my left arm, acting as if we were the most harmonious mother and daughter-in-law in the world. "Sir, here is the woman you're looking for. This is Lena, my darling daughter-in-law, who ordered all this expensive, luxurious food as a gift and a token of her utmost respect for me as her mother," Linda declared loudly, making absolutely sure all her high society friends heard her. Linda's friends looked at me with deep admiration, whispering among themselves about how incredibly lucky my mother-in-law was to have such a wealthy, generous daughter-in-law willing to drop thousands of dollars on her. I felt Linda's acrylic nails digging painfully into my arm. A hidden, forceful command, trying to make me nod and open my wallet. Not too far away, Paul stood holding his breath. Cold sweat was rapidly dripping down his forehead and soaking his collar. He looked at me with intense desperation, pleading with his eyes for me not to make a scene that would shatter his mother's fragile reputation in front of so many important people. But it seemed both of them had forgotten one crucial detail: I was not a mindless puppet they could manipulate and bully without a fight. I slowly peeled Linda's gripping fingers off my arm and took one confident step toward the manager holding out the receipt. "The total comes to exactly $5,000. Ma'am Lena, based on what we discussed on the phone yesterday, this needs to be paid in full, via credit card or wire transfer. Right now before we can fully open the buffet to the guests," the uniformed man stated formally. He extended a sleek black pen toward me and pointed to the blank signature line, fully expecting payment from the woman they assumed was a gullible pushover. A sudden, pin-drop silence draped over the entire room. Every single eye was glued to me, waiting for the sweet, touching scene where an obedient daughter-in-law silently pays for her mother-in-law's extravagance. Linda was already grinning from ear to ear, ready to celebrate her victory because she truly believed she had successfully trapped me. I took the clipboard containing the $5,000 invoice. I looked at it closely for a few seconds, acting as though I were casually reviewing the menu items. After that, I slowly lifted my face. I stared dead into the eyes of a celebrating Linda before turning back to the catering manager. Instead of showing panic, fear, or bursting into tears, as they expected. A remarkably sweet, calm smile graced my face. With an incredibly elegant motion, I handed the clipboard and the pen right back to the manager without letting a single drop of ink touch the paper. "I am so sorry, sir," I said, my smile unwavering. "But I absolutely refuse to pay this bill. Because I never ordered any of this food. Not ever." My voice was pitched high and crystal clear. It shattered the silence of the house like a bolt of lightning on a summer day. The words that left my mouth were spoken with eerie calmness, yet possessed a power that instantly killed the polite chuckles in the living room. The catering manager froze. The pen remained suspended in midair. Meanwhile, the dozens of eyes belonging to the guests all simultaneously snapped toward Linda, in utter shock and confusion. The triumphant smile on my mother-in-law's face instantly calcified. All the color drained from her cheeks, and her lips began to violently tremble due to the sheer shock of my blunt, public refusal. I remained standing tall and perfectly straight. I crossed my arms over my chest, maintaining the sweetest smile I could muster. I savored every single millisecond of the changing expression on the face of the woman who had just thrown my hard work into the garbage. "Lena, what on earth are you talking about? Stop joking around in front of the guests. Just take out your wallet and pay the man," Linda whispered, her voice shaking violently. She desperately reached for my arm again, but I swiftly took a step back to avoid her touch. Her thick foundation could no longer hide the bright, blotchy red flush creeping up her neck and cheeks from the intense, suffocating humiliation slowly consuming her. The society ladies in the front row started whispering furiously, fanning themselves dramatically. This only caused Linda to choke harder on the mounting tension. But I had zero intention of showing her any mercy. She built the stage, therefore, she had to act out the scene. "I am not joking, Linda," I replied. I intentionally raised my voice a notch, so it would carry all the way to the people standing out on the patio. "Since when do I have $5,000 to blow on a single lunch? You all know I'm just trying to run my little neighborhood diner." I looked at the manager with an apologetic expression and explained that the voice and phone number used to call them yesterday most certainly did not belong to me. I politely asked him to check their client logbook because I was absolutely certain someone else had fraudulently used my name for their own selfish interests. The manager, sensing that things were going horribly wrong, quickly flipped through the pages on his clipboard, his face turning dead serious. "I apologize, ma'am, but according to our records, the person who placed this order was an older woman who introduced herself as a representative for Miss Lena. And the contact number she provided is this one." The man read out a sequence of numbers that I was intimately familiar with. Every single person in the room simultaneously turned to look at Linda, who now looked like she was about to pass out from cardiac arrest. The number the manager had read out loud was her own personal cell phone number. Her dark, manipulative secret was completely blown wide open, right in front of the exact elitist country club circle she worshipped above all else. Paul, who had been standing frozen like a mannequin, finally stepped forward in a desperate attempt to cover up his family's utter disgrace. He grabbed my wrist with a bruising grip. "Lena, fix your attitude. Do not humiliate my mother in front of her friends. Just pay the damn bill. Use the savings you set aside for the diner's kitchen renovations," Paul hissed through gritted teeth. His eyes glared at me with an underlying threat. Instead of cowering at my husband's intimidation, I forcefully yanked my arm away until he lost his grip. I stared him down with cold, fearless eyes. I was deeply disappointed, but he had crossed the line too many times for me to ever yield to a man who didn't even have the spine to defend his own wife's basic rights. "That renovation money is my right, and it came from me sweating over a grill from dawn until dusk, Paul. Why on earth would I drain my business account? Just to pay for your mother's vanity because she ordered luxury catering without even having the decency to speak to me about it?" My loud, bold voice rendered Paul completely speechless. His entire face turned crimson red with shame. Several neighbors standing near the door nodded approvingly in agreement with my words, finally realizing just how incredibly toxic and abusive Linda had been to her young daughter-in-law. On the other side of the room, Linda's HOA and country club friends were subtly pulling out their iPhones. They pretended to be texting, but I knew for a fact they were recording this scorching family drama. Feeling completely cornered, with her precious pride teetering on the edge of total destruction, Linda suddenly went hysterical. She deployed her absolute favorite tactic, playing the victim. She clutched her chest dramatically, her hands shaking, and collapsed heavily onto the living room sofa, crying theatrical tears in front of her friends. "Oh my God, you are so shameless and cruel, Lena. I only did this for the good of your family, so people wouldn't judge you for being poor, and this is how you humiliate me?" She sobbed loudly, giant crocodile tears rolling down her wrinkled cheeks. She was desperately hoping this Oscar-worthy performance would flip the script and win back the guests' sympathy. But Martha, the HOA president and one of the most respected, wealthy women in their circle, stepped forward, fanning herself rapidly. She looked visibly irritated by the trashy spectacle unfolding in front of her. "Oh, please, Linda. So you're telling us this catering isn't even paid for? Good Lord. If we had known you were scamming your own family, we wouldn't have bothered showing up. And honestly, why would you treat your daughter-in-law like that?" Martha remarked in a soft but deadly tone that pierced straight through Linda's heart. The stinging rebuke from her closest friend was like a physical slap that instantly halted Linda's fake sobbing. She realized in that very moment that her carefully crafted mask of wealth and superiority had shattered into a million pieces. The catering manager, who couldn't care less about suburban family drama, tapped his pen against his clipboard. He was losing patience, demanding a final decision on what would happen to the lavish food laid out on the tables. "I am very sorry, ladies and gentlemen, but we are on a tight schedule. If no one can produce $5,000 within the next 5 minutes, we will be forced to pack all this food back into the truck and my staff will be leaving," the manager threatened with cold, uncompromising professionalism. Upon hearing that ultimatum, Linda trembled violently. She imagined just how irreparably destroyed her reputation would be when the catering company packed up the food on the very day of her grand luncheon because she was too broke to pay for it. She looked at Paul with a look of extreme pleading, silently ordering her son to do anything. But Paul just shook his head. He knew damn well that his bank accounts were scraped completely to the bone. Left with absolutely zero options, Linda turned her gaze to me. Her eyes were now swirling with intense hatred and a thirst for revenge. She finally realized that this time, she had been thoroughly and spectacularly defeated by the daughter-in-law she always looked down on. I merely returned that hateful glare with my sweetest, most radiant smile. Then, I elegantly turned on my heel and walked right out the front door, leaving the two of them trapped in the center of the hurricane they had created themselves. The atmosphere inside the house was as cold as ice, a sharp contrast to the blistering Texas summer heat outside. The catering manager checked his watch and gave a swift hand signal to the 4 waiters standing on standby by the door. Without a moment's hesitation, the uniformed men began extinguishing the flames of the portable stoves beneath the gold-plated food warmers. They rapidly clamped the lids back onto the prime rib and the truffle soup, completely ignoring the shocked, starving gazes of the guests who were already holding empty plates. Linda let out a weak shriek. She scrambled up from the sofa. Her legs were shaking so badly she almost tripped over the hem of her own sequin dress. "Sir, please, wait. Don't pack it up yet. The party hasn't even started. My guests haven't even tasted the bisque," Linda begged, her voice hoarse and reeking of sheer desperation. She tried to physically block one of the waiters from lifting a heavy food container, but the manager stepped in, blocking her with his clipboard. He coldly explained that their company policy was incredibly strict. No upfront payment meant not a single crumb of food could be left at the venue. In the corner of the living room, the society ladies began gossiping loudly. They no longer bothered to lower their voices, ensuring their toxic whispers would burn the ears of anyone listening. Goodness gracious, Linda is so pathetic. It was all just a cheap bluff. Premium catering. My foot. She can't even afford it. She tried to scam her own daughter-in-law, whispered a woman wearing a silk Hermes scarf. Her companion replied with a mocking laugh, declaring this the most embarrassing, tacky luncheon they had attended all year. Every single razor-sharp word struck Linda directly in the chest. The massive wall of arrogance she had spent decades meticulously building in our neighborhood completely crumbled to dust. Paul just stood there, leaning against the wall like a useless rock. His face was beet red from the overwhelming humiliation in front of the neighbors and distant relatives. He glanced out the door at me, standing calmly on the porch. His eyes were a mix of burning anger and utter frustration because he was entirely powerless. As a man who always hid behind his mother's skirt, he lacked the spine or the funds to reach into his own pocket because his wallet was empty. His company had just slashed his monthly bonuses, and the only thing keeping him afloat lately was the revenue from the diner that I ran entirely by myself. In less than 5 minutes, the massive buffet table was completely cleared out. The beautiful white linen tablecloth was aggressively folded up, leaving behind a bare, ugly wooden folding table looking incredibly sad in the middle of the large living room. The waiters marched out, carrying the heavy containers back into the truck. The heavy metal doors of the truck slammed shut, the sound echoing loudly down the suburban street. The delivery truck drove off, leaving behind only a thin trail of exhaust smoke and a deafening, suffocating silence in our living room. Linda collapsed back onto the sofa. This time, the tears streaming down her face were very real tears of bitter regret and furious anger, completely unlike her theatrical acting from earlier. She stared blankly at the empty table. She knew full well that within hours, this humiliating scandal would spread like wildfire through the entire town via the Neighborhood Next Door app and Facebook groups. The guests, still dressed to the nines in their fanciest outfits, looked at each other awkwardly. Their stomachs were starting to rumble because they hadn't eaten anything since early that morning. Linda's sky-high vanity had resulted in mass starvation at the center of what was supposed to be a grand feast. Amidst the incredibly awkward situation, Martha stepped forward and adjusted the strap of her Prada bag. She flashed a cold, extremely formal smile at Linda. "Well, Linda, since there apparently isn't any food, my friends and I are going to head out. My husband actually has a meeting at a hotel downtown anyway," Martha announced with a sarcastic, lethal farewell. That single goodbye triggered a massive domino effect. Almost all the high society ladies stood up and clustered toward the front door without leaving so much as a polite parting gift. They walked right past Linda as if she were a total stranger who no longer had any value in their social circle. Seeing her elite friends abandoning her, Linda turned her red, bloodshot, furious eyes toward me. I was still casually watching from the doorway. She stood up using whatever strength she had left. She pointed a trembling, rage-filled finger right at my face. "This is all your fault, Lena. You are a wicked, evil daughter-in-law. You brought nothing but bad luck to this family. If you had just compromised and brought out the cash, I wouldn't have been humiliated like this in front of Martha." Linda screamed like a madwoman, her voice echoing off the walls of the rapidly emptying room. Fueled by his mother's emotional outburst, Paul got swept up in the rage. He marched toward me aggressively. His eyes looked like he wanted to swallow me whole right, then and there. "Lena, you have gone way too far today. You stomped all over my mother's dignity and my authority as your husband in front of all these people. Where is your Christian grace? Where is your duty as a good wife? You go to church every Sunday." Paul yelled right in my face. He was desperately trying to intimidate me by using his supposed position as the head of the household. He genuinely thought that by using religion and my Catholic faith against me, I would be guilt-tripped into bowing my head and begging for forgiveness for my bold actions. But my husband's pathetic threats only elicited a crisp, genuine burst of laughter from my lips, a laugh completely dripping with mockery at their absolute shallowness. I slowly tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, smoothed my decent blouse, and stared directly into Paul's eyes with total, unwavering bravery. "Do not ever use God or my vows as a wife to cover up your disgusting greed, Paul. If you two actually respected me as a wife and a daughter-in-law, you wouldn't have thrown the food I sweated over into the literal garbage just to feed a pointless, shallow ego." My cold, razor-sharp response instantly shut Paul up. He took a step back, his face turning an even sicklier shade of pale. All the society friends had completely vacated our property. They left behind a scattering of folding chairs and a few plastic cups of water on the patio floor. The only people left in the living room were a few close relatives and nosy neighbors who were too embarrassed to leave abruptly without saying goodbye. Their stomachs began to send audible signals of hunger, creating an incredibly tense and awkward environment. Everyone just muttered to themselves while staring at the empty table. Linda was still glued to the sofa, breathing heavily and aggressively shredding a paper napkin in her hands as an outlet for her rage and humiliation. Paul was pacing back and forth near the kitchen door. His face was entirely scrunched up in stress, his hands constantly pulling at his own hair. He looked at the relatives who were still silently waiting for lunch. As the eldest son and the supposed host of this party, Paul knew it was a massive disgrace to his lineage if he sent them home starving. It would be the main topic of gossip at every family Thanksgiving for years to come. But his wallet was entirely empty, and he lacked the courage to even open his mobile banking app because he knew there were only pennies left. "Paul, do something. Do you want your aunts and uncles to pass out from hunger in our living room?" Linda shrieked, breaking the silence and deliberately making sure everyone in the house heard her. She glared daggers at me as I comfortably took a seat on a wooden chair in the corner, casually checking the online orders for my diner on my phone. My mother-in-law was apparently still holding out for a miracle, hoping my conscience would magically kick in and I would offer to cook all the food from scratch again. She assumed that because I was a relatively new daughter-in-law, my shame in front of the extended family would override my personal anger. Paul stopped right in front of me. His tall shadow blocked the light from the overhead bulb. "Lena, please. Have some mercy. Let's just forget about what happened earlier. This is a real emergency now," he pleaded. His tone completely flipped, shifting into full-blown begging. Swallowing whatever pride he had left, he begged me to go into the kitchen, open up my commercial stock of raw ingredients for the diner, and perform a miracle by cooking a feast in an hour to save his family's name. I set my phone face down on my lap. I adjusted my posture, sitting up perfectly straight, and offered my husband a minuscule smile. "Paul, the stock in the commercial freezer is for my diner's orders tomorrow. Every single ounce of that meat is already accounted for and reserved for my paying customers," I replied in a gentle but entirely unyielding tone that left absolutely zero room for negotiation. I also added that my physical energy had been entirely depleted since 2 a.m. cooking the brisket and stew that were currently acting as a feast for the flies in the garbage can. Hearing my cold, logical refusal, Paul swallowed hard. His throat was completely dry. Linda, on the other hand, suddenly shot up from the sofa. Her eyes widened as if they were about to pop out of their sockets. "You are the most selfish daughter-in-law on earth. We ask you to cook a little food, and you have a million excuses. Meanwhile, you're just freeloading and living rent-free in my son's house." Linda bellowed, aggressively stomping toward me. The word freeloading immediately caused several of the neighbors in the living room to furrow their brows. They exchanged glances, hiding secret, knowing smiles. They knew the absolute truth about who had been making the hefty monthly mortgage payments to the bank ever since we got married 2 years ago. I didn't scream back at Linda's insult. Instead, I let out a small, incredibly calm laugh. But it was more than enough to completely obliterate the foundation of this mother and son duo's pride. I stood up from my chair, smoothed out the wrinkles in my blouse, and stared my mother-in-law dead in the eyes without a single ounce of fear. "You are completely mistaken, Linda. This house was purchased using the down payment from my own personal savings. And every single month, I am the one who pays the mortgage to the bank using the profits from my diner." My voice was sharp, clear, and rang out perfectly in the quiet room. Linda instantly fell dead silent. Her jaw dropped open in profound shock. Paul immediately yanked on the sleeve of my shirt. His face was glowing red, because the dark financial secret he had been desperately hiding from his family for years was just exposed right in front of his aunts and uncles. "Lena, stop it. You're taking this way too far. Do not talk about money in front of my family," Paul hissed, his voice trembling with extreme embarrassment. He felt his fragile masculinity being crushed into a fine powder now that his relatives knew he was entirely dependent on his wife to keep a roof over his head. In the midst of the heated tension, Aunt Susan, my late father-in-law's younger sister, stood up, clutching her growling stomach. "That is quite enough, Linda, Paul. If there really isn't any food, we're going home." "I'd rather leave than sit here and watch this embarrassing marital dispute," Susan said, sounding utterly exhausted and disappointed. The other relatives also stood up, grabbing their purses and coats. They were visibly scowling, feeling completely scammed by an invitation to a lavish, upscale luncheon that yielded nothing but hot air and empty plates. One by one, the guests filed out the front door. Not a single person bothered to say goodbye or shake hands with Linda and Paul as hosts. The living room, which was supposed to be a grand stage for vanity and wealth, was now just a blank, depressing space reeking of cheap perfume and heavy regret. I simply stood near the wooden table, watching the shoulders of my husband and mother-in-law slowly slump downward amidst the ruins of their shattered illusions. A brand new plan was already finalized in my head. I knew the drama wasn't over yet, and I needed to prepare for the real cleansing that was about to take place. By nightfall, our house was as quiet as a graveyard. The only sound was the low hum of the old ceiling fan in the living room. The remnants of the afternoon's chaos still hung heavy in the air. The bare folding table hadn't been put away, and plastic cups were still scattered across the hardwood floors. Paul had locked himself in the guest bedroom. Since 6 p.m., he had refused to eat or speak to me, even though I purposely cooked a fragrant bowl of instant ramen just for myself. From the master bedroom across the hall, I could clearly hear Linda's muffled, agonizing sobs. She was actively mourning the violent death of her social reputation in front of her country club friends. I sat on the edge of my bed. I had already taken off my nice clothes and changed into comfortable pajamas. Using my smartphone, I opened my banking app and checked the account where I kept my diner's profits and the house fund. A massive, incredibly healthy balance flashed on the screen, absolute proof of my own blood, sweat, and tears, built without a single drop of help from my husband's family. I smiled a small, satisfied smile. I knew my bravery earlier was the perfect first step in taking back total control of my life, a life they had spent years trying to micromanage. A loud, aggressive knock on my door shattered my thoughts. It was immediately followed by the door flying open before I could even grant permission. Paul stood in the doorway, his eyes swollen and his t-shirt heavily wrinkled. He glared at me with cold, unadulterated hatred. He stepped inside and slammed the door shut behind him, creating a deafening bang. I didn't bother standing up. I just lifted my face and stared at him with an entirely blank, emotionless expression. "Lena, tomorrow morning you are coming with me to Martha's house to personally apologize for the absolute humiliation you caused today," Paul ordered, trying to project a fake sense of authority. He added that his mother hadn't stopped crying because she had just read that she was permanently kicked out of the HOA group chat and the country club committee. Paul figured the only way to salvage his mother's reputation was to use me as the scapegoat to spin a lie that I had gone hysterical and had a mental breakdown in front of the crowd. Hearing the pathetic, laughable script he had invented to save his mommy, I couldn't stop a sarcastic laugh from escaping. I crossed my arms and looked at my husband. "Are you out of your mind, Paul? Why on earth would I apologize for a sin your mother committed?" She acted like a criminal, throwing away hundreds of dollars worth of food. I asked calmly, yet my words were sharp, suppressing the fiery rage bubbling in my chest. Paul stepped closer until there was only a few feet between us. His jaw clenched tight, and the veins in his neck bulged from extreme anger. "A criminal? That is my mother, Lena. How dare you call her a criminal just over some stupid food?" Paul yelled, struggling to keep his voice low enough so the neighbors wouldn't hear. He firmly insisted that as a good Christian and a dedicated wife, it was my absolute duty to cover up the family's ugly flaws and obey my husband's orders. Not to be stubborn and rebellious. I stood up from the bed so we were perfectly eye to eye. Paul instinctively took a half step back, clearly not expecting a physical, confident confrontation from me. "What flaws am I supposed to cover up, Paul? The fact that your mother is an arrogant, manipulative liar, willing to scam people just for her pride? Or the fact that my husband is dead broke and just stands there letting his own wife be emotionally abused?" My words were like arrows that buried themselves directly into the weakest, most insecure parts of Paul's masculinity. Paul turned ghostly pale. His mouth opened slightly, but not a single word came out to counter my argument, because every syllable I spoke was a stone-cold fact. He stared out the window, his breathing rapid and heavy. I knew perfectly well that he constantly used the fear of God and his title as husband to push me down, entirely because, in reality, he had absolutely nothing to be proud of financially in this house. "If you're going to stay stubborn and refuse to apologize tomorrow morning, then don't blame me when I file for divorce first thing tomorrow," Paul threatened in a low, dark voice. He deployed the threat of a messy divorce as his ultimate, nuclear weapon to terrify me and bring me to my knees. He genuinely believed that, as a 25-year-old woman, being a divorcee was the single most terrifying thing in the world to me. But he had forgotten one incredibly crucial detail: I was a fiercely independent woman with my own money. I was not a leech attached to his painfully thin wallet. I walked over to the bedroom door, pulled it wide open, and pointed directly out into the hallway. "Paul, if signing divorce papers is the price I have to pay to protect my dignity from your mother's abuse, I will gladly sign them the second the sun comes up." I flashed him the coldest, most chilling smile imaginable. He froze dead in his tracks. His eyes widened in absolute shock as he finally witnessed a core of steel inside me that he realized he could never, ever break. The morning of the following day began with a much softer, almost hesitant knock on my door. I had just finished my morning prayers when Paul knocked. His burning rage from the night before seemed to have completely vanished, replaced by exhausted, deeply anxious eyes. He was no longer in his wrinkled clothes. He was wearing his freshly ironed corporate uniform for the office. In his hand, he held a heavy brown envelope bearing the logo of a prominent national bank. "Lena." A letter came from the bank. "It's addressed to you." "It was in the mailbox early this morning," Paul said softly, a massive departure from his aggressive divorce threats from the night before. He handed the envelope over awkwardly, his eyes darting around the bedroom, seemingly trying to gauge if I was actually serious about what I said last night. I took the brown envelope without a word. I carefully tore the edge and pulled out a thick stack of high-quality paper. The document was the official property deed and title transfer for the house. Now, the land and the house were fully, legally, and exclusively in my name after a long administrative process. As I was reading through the pages, Linda suddenly emerged from the hallway, dragging her feet. Her face looked incredibly withered, completely devoid of her signature red lipstick. "What is that letter?" "Paul, don't tell me it's the bill from the catering company sent directly here?" Linda asked, her voice laced with pure panic. She was still so traumatized from yesterday's disaster that she was hypersensitive to any piece of paper that even slightly resembled an invoice. She shuffled closer, trying to peek at the papers in my hand. I turned the documents around to face both of them, tapping my finger against the bold words and the official county seal that proved my exclusive, sole ownership of the property. "This isn't a catering bill, Linda. This is the official, legal document proving that the house the three of us are currently standing in belongs entirely and exclusively to me. It is no longer in Paul's name." I spoke in a clear, hardened tone, making absolutely sure every single word penetrated their thick skulls. Linda gasped sharply. She had to grip the edge of the hallway console table as her knees buckled beneath her. Paul aggressively snatched the papers from my hand. He scanned every line, his eyes widening in horror and his breathing accelerating. "Lena, you did this behind my back? How the hell did the bank agree to this?" Paul yelled, his face turning so pale it looked like a bucket of ice water had been dumped over his head. It finally dawned on him that because of the post-nuptial agreement we signed, and the undeniable paper trail proving the mortgage came strictly from my accounts for the past 24 months, the bank easily transferred full ownership to me. "Of course they agreed, Paul. Because for the last 2 years, every single dollar paid toward this property came from my diner's profits. Not from your salary, which is constantly drained funding your mother's luxury shopping and country club fees," I replied, crossing my arms as I watched his entire reality shatter. I reminded him that a few months ago, he had willingly signed a quitclaim waiver precisely because his own financial negligence was causing the mortgage to go into default. Paul swallowed hard. He knew his absolute last weapon to control me had vanished into thin air. When Linda realized that her family was on the brink of total homelessness, her strategy instantly shifted from hurling accusations to full-blown weeping and wailing. "Paul, why are you so stupid? The beautiful house I've been showing off to all the neighbors belongs to this woman now?" Linda sobbed hysterically, repeatedly slapping her son's shoulder with whatever weak strength she had left. Her shock was twofold. Not only had her reputation among her rich friends been incinerated, but she was now officially just a freeloading guest in the home of the daughter-in-law she so deeply despised. A few neighbors who were out sweeping their driveways glanced over at our open front door. Linda's hysterical screams were echoing clearly down the street. I purposely didn't close the door. I wanted the entire neighborhood to know that the wheel of fate inside our household had finally turned in the right direction. I calmly walked into the kitchen, grabbed my small leather sling bag, and got ready to head to the diner. Just like always, I completely ignored the theatrical drama of the mother and son. As far as I was concerned, my era of playing the foolish, obedient victim was permanently over. Paul physically blocked my path at the front door. His pale face was now twisted into an expression of desperate begging. It was a far cry from the arrogance of a supposed head of the household. "Lena, please don't leave yet. Let's sit down and talk about this like adults. I'm so sorry if I hurt you by bringing up divorce last night," he whispered, his body physically shaking. He reached out, trying to grab the hem of my shirt, but I swiftly sidestepped him. He knew that if I walked out that door and cut off the funding for the house, he and his mother wouldn't survive a single month. I stopped and looked at the two of them, flashing a sweet but incredibly intimidating smile. "It is way too late for us to talk, Paul. The decision is entirely yours. You both either learn to deeply respect the sole owner of this house, or you better start packing your bags into boxes before the sun goes down," I stated with total calmness. Before either could respond, I walked out the door, leaving them drowning in sorrow and profound terror inside a house that no longer belonged to them. The intoxicating aroma of sautéed garlic, onions, and bay leaves sizzling in the massive cast-iron skillets of my diner instantly erased whatever lingering stress remained in my chest from that morning. The moment I stepped into my corner kitchen, I tied my black apron around my waist and began prepping hundreds of lunch orders. My loyal customers, ranging from corporate office workers in suits to local delivery drivers, started pouring in, forming a neat line in front of my glass display case. It was here, in this bustling little diner, that I completely found my dignity again. Here, every single dollar that went into the cash register was the direct result of my own sweat, honesty, and relentless hard work. Around 1:00 p.m., right in the middle of the lunch rush, a cheap yellow taxi pulled up right in front of my diner. The door opened, and Linda stepped out. Every step she took was hesitant and awkward. It was a million miles away from her usual, confident runway model strut. Today, she was wearing a simple, faded sundress. There was absolutely no sparkling jewelry, no thick gold rings adorning her fingers. Her withered face, entirely devoid of makeup, instantly became the center of attention for several neighbors sipping iced tea at the tables outside. Linda slowly walked up to the counter where I was standing. Her eyes were darting wildly, staring hungrily at the massive trays of delicious comfort food the customers were eagerly buying. She kept swallowing hard, clearly trying to suppress an intense, gnawing hunger. Because of yesterday's disaster, not a single grain of rice or piece of meat had entered her stomach in over 24 hours. I maintained my strict professionalism. I greeted my mother-in-law with a polite nod and the exact same small, standard smile I gave to every paying customer. I offered her absolutely no VIP treatment or special seating. "Lena, can we please talk in the back? I have something really important to say," Linda whispered. Her voice was as quiet as a mouse, trembling with fear. Her piercing, bossy tone was completely gone, replaced by a pathetic quiver because she was terrified of the customers overhearing her. I glanced at my kitchen staff, who were rapidly packing up to-go boxes, and then gestured for Linda to follow me to a small wooden table in the back alley, far away from the dining crowd. As soon as we sat down, Linda tightly clasped her hands together on the table. She looked at me, tears welling up in her eyes, looking fully prepared to weep in regret. "Lena, please forgive me. I admit I was completely wrong yesterday. I lost my mind because I got too caught up in trying to impress my country club friends," she stammered, nervously wringing the hem of her faded dress. She added that earlier that morning, Martha had shown up at the house and explicitly threatened to post the video of yesterday's humiliation to the neighborhood Nextdoor app and Facebook groups if the cancellation fee to the luxury restaurant wasn't paid. Immediately, hearing Martha's name, I just leaned back against my wooden chair, perfectly relaxed. I calmly explained to Linda that any debt, penalty, or cancellation fee regarding the $5,000 catering bill was the sole legal responsibility of the person who placed the order over the phone. I firmly reiterated that my name was not officially tied to their caller ID or signed on their receipt, so the restaurant had absolutely no legal grounds to come after me. Linda turned deathly pale once again upon hearing my blunt explanation. She finally realized her human shield was entirely gone. But Lena, if I don't pay that catering company, I'll be branded a scammer all over town. I won't ever be able to step out of the house out of sheer embarrassment. Linda sobbed, her voice cracking in pure agony. She practically begged me on her hands and knees to lend her the $5,000 from the diner's business funds. She even swore she would pay me back in monthly installments from the small allowance Paul might give her in the future. It was incredibly laughable to think that the desperate mother-in-law begging me for cash right now was the exact same woman who had ruthlessly dumped my brisket into the trash can just 24 hours prior. I took a deep breath, staring into her aged eyes with zero anger, but absolutely zero pity. I cannot touch my business capital just to salvage your ego, Linda. Just yesterday, I was fully prepared to serve a free, incredibly delicious feast for your party. But you were the one who made the conscious choice to throw it all in the garbage, I replied in a cold, crystal clear tone. Linda fell dead silent. She hunched forward, her shoulders shaking violently as the reality set in. Her own monumental arrogance had dragged her into this inescapable quicksand. Before she could muster a response, the cell phone inside her purse began ringing loudly. Paul's name flashed across the cracked screen. She answered the call with trembling hands, and immediately, my husband's panicked, frantic voice echoed from the speaker. I could read the absolute terror on Linda's face as Paul explained that he had just been called into his company's HR department. His massive personal debts and plummeting credit score were now actively jeopardizing his corporate job. Paul was weeping in frustration on the line, having no idea where to borrow money because every single one of his credit cards had been maxed out and blocked. Feeling faint, Linda ended the call. She stared blankly into space, looking as though her entire universe had just collapsed in on itself. I stood up, adjusted my black apron, and gently patted her shoulder before heading back to the bustling counter. Eat first, Linda. It's on the house. Eat your daughter-in-law's blue-collar food before you go home and help Paul pack your bags to get out of my house. I delivered the line with the sweetest, most radiant smile, dealing the final, fatal blow to whatever microscopic shred of pride she had left. The golden light of the setting sun pierced through the living room windows, casting long shadows over the stacks of cardboard boxes and massive duffel bags littering the floor of my house. The home that used to constantly echo with Linda's shrieking demands was now eerily quiet, suffocating, and dripping with the heavy atmosphere of total defeat. Paul was sitting Indian-style on the floor next to his bags, his head bowed deeply, hiding his face in his hands. In the corner, Linda was tightly hugging an old throw pillow, actively mourning and constantly wiping tears from her wrinkled, exhausted face. I walked into the house after closing the diner early. I wanted a front row seat to the finale of the tragedy they had written for themselves. I walked right past them toward the kitchen, set my bag on the counter, and leaned comfortably against the wall. There was absolutely no anger left in my chest. The only thing I felt was a massive, overwhelming sense of relief because, finally, justice had carved its own path. Lena, are you really capable of kicking us out into the street? I am your husband, and this is the mother who raised me, Paul said, his voice hoarse and trembling as he attempted to stand up. His eyes were no longer glaring with threats, they only reflected the bottomless despair of a man who had completely lost his footing in life. He was trying to guilt-trip me, playing the family loyalty card. He was still foolishly hoping that my heart, which they had stomped on repeatedly, would magically soften. I stared at my soon-to-be ex-husband with zero emotion. A thin, knowing smile graced my lips before I answered. I am not kicking you out, Paul. I am simply taking back my legal right to the house that I purchased using my own sweat, working from dawn until dusk. I answered calmly, my voice perfectly steady. I reminded him that the two of them were the ones who destroyed this marriage the very moment they treated my hard work and love like literal garbage. Hearing that, Linda practically crawled forward, desperately trying to grab the hem of my pants with her trembling hands, completely broken by shame. Lena, please, just give me one more month. Martha keeps calling me, demanding I pay the catering penalty. I have nowhere else to run to but this house, she wailed, her voice weak and pathetic. The woman who had once condemned my cooking as a total embarrassment was now literally on her knees before the daughter-in-law she constantly called trash. I took a deliberate step back to avoid her grasping hands. I flat out refused to fall for her emotional manipulation. I firmly informed them that I had already paid 3 months' rent in advance for a small, cramped apartment near the downtown bus station. It was my absolute final obligation to them before I officially filed the divorce papers at the county courthouse. Paul gasped sharply upon hearing the words apartment and divorce. He turned an even sicklier shade of white as the reality hit him. His endless subservience to his mother's massive ego had permanently nuked his own future. He stared at his packed clothes. Within a few hours, his social status as a wealthy, successful suburban husband would crumble in front of all his corporate co-workers. You really have no respect for the sanctity of marriage, Lena. You are destroying everything just over some stupid food. Paul yelled, desperately trying to squeeze out the very last drop of his dying pride. But his threat was incredibly hollow and had absolutely zero effect on me. I answered him with the fierce, blazing eyes of a woman who was finally completely free from financial and emotional abuse. This was never just about the food, Paul. It was about respect, boundaries, and the fact that you happily stood by and let your mother trample on my human dignity, just so she could look rich to strangers. Silence fell over the living room once again. The only sound was the rumble of the rented U-Haul truck pulling up in front of our driveway. 2 burly movers walked in after I gave them a nod, signaling that they could start loading the boxes. Paul and Linda could do nothing but watch helplessly as their belongings were carried out to the truck, one by one, under the dim glow of the streetlights. With heavy, dragging footsteps and heads bowed in ultimate shame, the 2 people who used to act like royalty in this house walked out the front door without a single, sweet goodbye. I stood in the doorway, firmly locked the front door, and took a deep, refreshing breath while looking up at the evening sky. Tonight, their fragile sandcastle built on lies had officially washed away, and I was fully prepared to embrace the next chapter of my life with absolute freedom. The feeling the next morning was entirely foreign and wonderful. There were no more heavy, angry footsteps. There were no more demanding shrieks, and there was no more suffocating, toxic tension in the kitchen. I woke up early, offered a prayer of gratitude in the peaceful silence of my home, and brewed a fresh pot of hot coffee. As I looked around my spotless kitchen, I could feel the total, unadulterated freedom that had been violently denied to me for the last 2 years. Just before I left for the diner, a process server pulled up to my gate holding a thick yellow envelope. It was the official summons for the divorce proceedings I had filed. It had been 3 days since the eviction. I accepted the documents and signed for them with a perfectly calm heart, without a single drop of regret. Simultaneously, my phone vibrated with a flood of text messages from an unknown number. The background of the photos sent showed Paul sitting in a tiny, cramped, depressing apartment. The texts were paragraphs of desperate begging. He swore he would change, promised he would completely cut off his mother, and begged me to drop the divorce. It seemed Paul had finally tasted the bitter reality. He was now the one forced to do his own laundry and cook his own cheap meals. I merely skimmed the messages and hit the block button, prioritizing my absolute peace of mind. I walked down the street toward my diner. I felt incredibly light, wearing my favorite blouse and a simple pair of jeans. Along the way, the neighbors smiled at me, displaying a much deeper, more genuine level of respect. The news had already spread like wildfire through the suburb about how I bravely fought off Linda's $5,000 catering scam and legally kept my house. They no longer looked at me as the pitiful, bullied daughter-in-law, but rather as a highly intelligent, fiercely courageous woman. My diner was absolutely packed to the brim that afternoon. Some of my signature dishes had recently gone viral on TikTok and Facebook. Several local Dallas food vloggers had actually shown up to taste and lavishly praise my smoked brisket. And Southern chicken stew, the exact same recipes Linda had thrown in the garbage. My cash register literally did not stop ringing. It felt as though this was God's direct reward for all the silent tears I had endured in the past. My profits that day alone tripled compared to the previous months. While I was bustling behind the counter, my eyes caught a glimpse of a woman hiding behind a telephone pole across the street. It was Linda. She looked incredibly thin and frail. She was wearing a faded, threadbare dress that had almost entirely lost its color. According to the local neighborhood gossip, she was now the ultimate laughingstock of her former country club friends. She had been forced to pawn off all her fake designer bags and cheap jewelry just to slowly pay off the massive debt to the luxury restaurant. Her mask of being a wealthy socialite had been permanently destroyed. She was now just an ordinary, broke woman drowning in debt because of her own toxic pride. She hesitantly took a step to cross the street, looking as though she was about to beg me for a free meal. But when our eyes locked, I didn't show an ounce of anger or hatred. I simply gave her a small, sweet, heavily loaded smile of absolute victory. My sheer confidence was more than enough to freeze her dead in her tracks in the middle of the road. Overcome with unbearable shame, she quickly turned around and hurried away, her head hung low in total defeat. A few moments later, a notification from a popular local news page on Facebook popped up on my phone. It was an article discussing the rising trend of fake suburban flexing and HOA debt scandals, leading to legal action. In the comments section, hundreds of women were passionately supporting daughters-in-law who bravely fought back against arrogant, toxic in-laws. I smiled warmly. I was genuinely happy to be an inspiration for women everywhere to stand firmly on their own 2 feet. I also heard through the grapevine that Paul had just received his second formal warning at work because aggressive debt collectors were constantly calling his office switchboard, looking for his mother. Because he no longer had my diner's profits to leech off of, he was struggling immensely just to scrape together enough pennies for his cheap rent and groceries. The wheel of fortune had entirely crushed the man who relied completely on his wife, but chose his foolish pride over her. They were now actively facing the brutal punishment of their own vanity. When late afternoon arrived, I returned to my beautiful blue house. I sat out on the patio, slowly sipping a mug of hot coffee. As I savored the cool evening breeze, I glanced down at the property deed safely tucked inside my bag and took a long, deep breath. There was no more heavy burden, no more tears, and absolutely zero fear for tomorrow. Because I knew, with absolute certainty, that my future rested entirely in my own capable hands. A free, incredibly sweet smile settled permanently on my face. I am Lena. 25 years old. The woman who completely shattered the arrogance of her abusive mother-in-law in the most elegant, honorable, and devastating way possible.